one of the biggest threats to the Second Amendment is to ban certain guns. And many of these threats of guns that are going to be banned, most Americans own these guns. These are very common guns that are used to preserve the Second Amendment and preserve our Constitution, is why the Second Amendment was even written. But if there was to be laws passed that would ban certain guns, and don't think it can't happen because it's happened in the past and it most likely will happen in the future. If there are laws passed that ban certain guns, what does mass confiscation look like? Well, to be honest, the government has already laid all this out and they're very good at it. So nothing new would have to be created. Now, before we get into it, I do want to take a moment and thank our sponsor, ES Power Drink, for not just supporting this channel, but allowing me to put down Trinidad scorpion peppers in a drink, and I can reap the health benefits of it. I've lost over 30 pounds. And I'm not taking, there's a lot of people injecting themselves with some pretty poisonous stuff out there to lose weight. And you're much better off eating a vegetable if you can do it. I can't eat Trinidad scorpion peppers. This allows me to put it down. It also builds up a tolerance to the point where I will eventually be able to eat them. As a matter of fact, recently I've been kind of thinking I might like to try one. So I recommend it. A friend of mine made this drink. Now you can buy it. That link is below. If you were to take a look at the biggest threats to the Second Amendment in this country today, there's a pretty good list. And a lot of these are revolving around the federal courts. And a lot of them are revolving around our politics. And they're real threats. And the one I want to talk about today is mass confiscation, where the government deems a certain firearm illegal, and they decide to confiscate all of them. And you might say, well, they don't know that I have one. How would they know? And really what I'm getting at is if you look at one of the biggest threats, it's the threat of banning what is deemed as assault weapons. And I would argue what they're talking about is they're talking about semi-automatic rifles that have a pistol grip and are magazine fed. Let's just be really honest. What is it they're talking about? That's what they're talking about. And there's a large range of rifles that fit in that category. And I want to talk about what mass confiscation in the United States of these rifles really looks like. Because it really wouldn't be that hard to go about doing this. For starters, if a law was passed, let's begin, it would be unconstitutional, but if it, we see that anyway. And I really don't want to lean on the Supreme Court. Let's pause for a second on what the confiscation looks like. I don't want to lean on the Supreme Court because what I've seen is even when the Supreme Court goes for the Second Amendment, the anti-Second Amendment laws just double down. So, for example, when we saw the New York Rifle and Pistol Club versus Corlett come out and, ultimately the Supreme Court said everybody in this country has the right to carry outside of their home. And that was good news. But I have less rights now since they said that than I did before that. Like they double down. Anytime the Supreme Court says, here's more freedom, Second Amendment, anti-Second Amendment efforts double down. So, let's just say that I don't really feel comfortable saying, oh, well, the Supreme Court won't let them do that. All right. Now, with that being said, what this looks like is if a law was to be passed and they said, all right, these, and they'd have a list, it would be a list. And then if you happen to have one of these firearms on this list, so they'd ban a list. There'd be a giant list of guns. And it's probably going to include handguns with a pistol grip is my guess, and accepts magazines. I could be wrong, but let's just stick to the rifles for a bit. If they pass a law and they create a list, how will they know that you own one of those guns or many of those guns? All they'll have to do, and this is what they will do, this is what they'll do. They'll do reverse traces on all of them, and it'll ultimately lead to your front door. So if you went out and you bought one of these rifles, and you have it, all they're going to have to do is go to that manufacturer of that rifle, and they'll get a list. It'll be massive. It'll be a massive undertaking, but it won't be that hard because they're already very good at it. They'll get a massive list of all the serial numbers of all the guns that they made that fit that description or fit that model number or whatever. And then they will then say, okay, who'd you sell these to? And they'll say these distributors, and there's not many of them. It's not like it's thousands and thousands of distributors. It's dozens and dozens of distributors. And they'll go to those distributors, and the distributors will then have the records because they have to keep them, and they'll say who they sold them to, and that will lead them to the gun store. And then they'll go to the gun store and they'll have a massive list, and they'll just sit there in their office, and they'll have to break out the records with that massive list, and they'll just one by one, all right, this one we sold to this person, and this one we sold to that person, and this one we sold to that person. And now they know every single human in America that went into a gun store and purchased one of these rifles. And then that leads them to your front door. And if you sold it or you lost it in a boating accident or whatever the case may be, you're at least going to have to explain it to a federal officer of some sort. And that's how they do it, ladies and gentlemen. It's not that complicated. It wouldn't be a massive undertaking. It would be, and they wouldn't, just be individual people. So, and there's nothing your sheriff can do about it. It's like, let's say you're like, well, I live in a county like Missouri or Wyoming or somewhere where I feel safe here. Nobody can infringe on my Second Amendment rights. I trust my local sheriff. It won't be your local sheriff doing this. It'll be federal officers coming to your door, and they're going to want to know where that firearm is. This is how it plays out. Now, historically, people have been able to grandfather in firearms. So historically, when the federal government has banned guns in the past, certain guns, the people who own them can grandfather them, but they have to register them, so now you're on a registry. So, there's a high likelihood you'd probably be able to keep it. You're just going to have to register it with the federal government. Now, all of this is illegal, by the way. It's all incredibly unconstitutional because the Second Amendment was, for a couple reasons. And according to the Supreme Court, the Second Amendment was written not so you can hunt. It was written so you can preserve your life, so you can protect yourself. The other reason the Supreme Court says this is illegal is because when the Second Amendment was written, you have to look at historically what was the parameters put on firearms. Well, there weren't any. There weren't any restrictions at all. So historically, there was never a restriction on a firearm. And the firearms historically that they were talking about were weapons of war. These were muskets that men carried on the battlefield in the revolution of the United States. So, this is, historically they're talking about weapons of war. How are you going to preserve this country from a tyrannical government that has weapons of war if you don't have weapons of war? How are you supposed to do that? Well, you can't. Like, I can't defend my country against a tyrannical government with a bolt rifle while they all have AR-style rifles. I need an AR style rifle to do that. You know, that's what the Second Amendment was written for. So all this is incredibly illegal, but it's what it will look like. Like, that's really what it will look like. If they ban certain rifles or handguns or any guns at all, this is all they have to do. And even if you bought it used, like let's say you bought it used, well, they're going to go to that store that sold it new. They're going to go to that owner who bought it, and he's going to say, well, I sold it to this gun store. And then they're going to go back to that other gun store. And then that is going to still lead to you. Because as long as you bought it from an FFL, it leads to your front door. There is a path, and they're very good at reverse traces. Like, this is what many of these people do for a living every single day. Like, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of reverse traces taking place right now through the federal government, where they're doing this exact same process. But they're doing it because maybe they found, like, if there's a crime committed and then there's a gun found, they do a reverse trace. This is how they locate who owns this gun. And all they do is they'll just do the same thing, but just on a massive scale. And they're very good at it. They're very efficient at it. They've been doing it for decades. There won't be anything new that will have to happen other than the law being passed. But once that law is passed, this is how it'll all play out. Don't be deceived. So there you go. Any thoughts or insight on any of this, definitely put it below. I do want to take a moment and say most people watch this channel, not subscribers. Click that subscribe button. Greatly increases the algorithm and our ability to get these messages out. That link is also below. But the most important part of this channel is we take prayer requests. So please don't ever hesitate to send that in. Thank you for watching this episode of God, Family, and Guns. And as always, love God, love your family, and love guns.